A pregnant woman was abandoned by the man she trusted most with just one cruel ultimatum: choose him, or keep the baby. With nowhere left to go, she disappeared into the mountains, believing an old, collapsing cabin was the only place she and her unborn daughter could survive. But what happened next, no one could have imagined. A lonely mountain man, carrying a heartbreaking secret of his own, made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. Before this story ends, a devastating blizzard, an impossible birth, and one extraordinary act of love will prove that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find the family you were always meant to have. Stay with us, because every moment of this journey leads to an ending you'll never forget. Sarah Whitmore never imagined that one tiny blue line could erase the future she had spent years building. At 36, she believed her life was finally falling into place. She had a successful career as an interior designer in Seattle, a beautiful apartment overlooking the waterfront, and a fiancé everyone admired. From the outside, her life looked flawless. But perfection has a cruel way of hiding the cracks until the moment everything shatters. The day she told her fiancé she was pregnant, she expected tears of joy, maybe nervous laughter, maybe a long conversation about becoming parents. Instead, he looked at her as though she had become a stranger. His voice turned cold. His eyes lost every trace of love. Then came 6 words that would destroy everything she believed about the man she trusted. Choose me, or choose the baby. Within 48 hours, the engagement was over. The apartment no longer felt like home. The future she had carefully planned vanished with a single ultimatum. Alone, heartbroken, and carrying a child no one else wanted. Sarah packed everything she could fit into her aging SUV and disappeared into the remote Cascade Mountains. Waiting there was an abandoned log cabin left behind by her late grandfather, a place forgotten by almost everyone. The roof leaked, the walls groaned in the wind, the electricity barely worked. It was never meant to become a home, especially not for a pregnant woman trying to survive one of the harshest mountain winters in decades. But Sarah didn't know that someone had been quietly watching that empty cabin for years. A man who had buried his own wife. A man who had lost the daughter he never got to hold. A man who had sworn he would never open his heart again. Neither of them could imagine that the next few months would change their lives forever. Because before this story reaches its ending, a violent snowstorm will trap them together. A baby will fight to enter the world under impossible circumstances. A man with nothing left to lose will face the hardest decision of his life. And one heartbreaking choice will reveal what real love truly looks like. If Sarah had turned her car around that day, none of what happened next would have been possible. The first week in the mountains felt less like a fresh start and more like a punishment Sarah had chosen for herself. Every morning, she woke to absolute silence. No traffic, no neighbors, no phone notifications demanding her attention. Only the endless whisper of towering pines swaying in the cold wind. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, it felt painfully lonely. The old cabin was far worse than she remembered from childhood. Rain leaked through the ceiling whenever clouds gathered. The floor creaked beneath every step. Half the windows refused to close properly, allowing icy drafts to sweep through the rooms long after sunset. Every night she wrapped herself in layers of blankets, one hand resting protectively over her growing stomach. "It's okay," she whispered to the tiny life inside her. "I don't know how yet, but I'll make this work." She repeated those words so often they became less of a promise and more of a desperate prayer. The nearest grocery store sat nearly 30 miles away. After making the exhausting drive into town for supplies, Sarah found herself struggling to carry several heavy bags back toward the cabin. The steep gravel road seemed twice as long on the return trip. Halfway up the hill, an old pickup truck slowed beside her. The driver rolled down his window. "You'll never make it before dark carrying all that." His voice was deep, calm, almost emotionless. Sarah looked up cautiously. The man appeared to be in his early 40s. Broad shoulders, thick beard streaked with early gray, weathered skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. His flannel jacket was faded from countless winters, and rough hands rested casually on the steering wheel. "I'm fine," she answered automatically. The stranger nodded once. "If you say so." Without another word, he drove away. Sarah watched the truck disappear around the bend, strangely irritated by how easily he'd accepted her refusal. She wasn't used to people leaving after hearing no. Yet somehow, his silence lingered longer than any conversation could have. That night, everything changed. A violent spring storm crashed into the mountains. Lightning split the sky. Thunder rolled through the valley hard enough to shake the cabin's walls. At 3 o'clock in the morning, an icy drop of water landed squarely on Sarah's forehead. She blinked awake. Another drop, then another. Within minutes, water poured through 3 different places in the ceiling. She scrambled from bed, dragging buckets, cooking pots, even empty coffee mugs beneath the leaks. Rain hammered against the roof like thousands of tiny hammers. The old cabin groaned under the assault. Then came the sound she would never forget. Crack! A section of the ceiling collapsed onto the floor, spraying soaked insulation and splintered wood across the room. Sarah froze. Her breathing became shallow. The realization struck harder than the storm itself. If that section had fallen only 2 feet to the left, it would have landed directly on her bed. On her baby. For the first time since leaving Seattle, genuine fear overwhelmed her determination. This wasn't an adventure. This wasn't independence. She and her daughter could actually die here. When daylight finally broke, the rain hadn't stopped. Sarah found an old blue tarp inside the storage shed. Ignoring the icy wind and slippery shingles, she dragged a ladder against the porch roof and climbed upward. Every movement sent pain shooting through her lower back. The heavy tarp caught the wind like a sail, nearly pulling her off balance. The ladder shifted. Her heart stopped. She grabbed desperately for the roof's edge. One wrong move. One loose board. One slip. Everything would end before her daughter ever took her first breath. "What on earth are you doing?" The voice exploded through the rain. Startled, Sarah nearly lost her footing. She looked down. Standing below, soaked by the downpour, was the same mountain man she'd met on the road. His expression wasn't angry. It was terrified. He rushed forward without hesitation, planting both hands firmly against the ladder to keep it from sliding. "Climb down," he ordered. "Now." For a split second, Sarah almost argued. Pride told her she could handle it alone. Reality reminded her she was trembling so badly she could barely stand. Slowly, she climbed down one careful step at a time. The moment her boots touched the ground, the stranger let out a quiet breath, as though he had been holding it the entire time. He looked toward the shattered roof, then back at Sarah. "You don't need courage," he said quietly. "You need a roof that won't kill you." Those simple words changed everything, because neither of them realized it yet. That storm hadn't just destroyed an old cabin. It had quietly begun building a future neither one believed they deserved. The storm finally passed, but the silence it left behind felt strangely different. For 2 days, the mountain seemed to hold its breath. Sarah expected the stranger to disappear from her life the way everyone else eventually had. Instead, on the 3rd morning, the sound of a truck echoed through the trees. She stepped onto the porch and froze. The mountain man stood beside his pickup, unloading fresh lumber, heavy tarps, toolboxes, and bundles of cedar shingles as if he had already made up his mind before arriving. "You came back," Sarah said. He shrugged. I said the roof needed more than patches. She crossed her arms. I can't afford to hire you. I'm not here for money. I don't accept charity. For the first time, something that almost resembled a smile crossed his weathered face. Good. He looked toward the collapsing cabin. Neither do I. Sarah frowned. Then why are you here? Instead of answering, he reached into the truck and unfolded a large sheet of paper. It wasn't an estimate. It wasn't a repair plan. It was a blueprint. A complete cabin. 1 bedroom? A bright kitchen facing the morning sun. A covered porch. Large windows overlooking the valley. Even a small nursery tucked beside the master bedroom. Sarah stared at it in disbelief. You drew this? He nodded. Last night. You designed a house for you. Her head snapped upward. No. The answer escaped before she could even think. No, absolutely not. He remained perfectly calm. You didn't even hear the offer. I don't need someone rescuing me. I know. I don't need anyone feeling sorry for me. I don't. Then why? Finally. He looked directly into her eyes. Because I know what it feels like. To lose everything. The words landed with a weight she couldn't explain. There was no self-pity. No attempt to earn sympathy. Only truth. He folded the blueprint carefully. My wife and I were expecting a baby. Sarah's breathing slowed. We built our own house. His eyes drifted toward the mountains beyond the trees. She never got to live in it. Silence swallowed the clearing. The wind rustled through the pine branches overhead. No dramatic music. No tears. Just 2 broken people standing among unfinished dreams. What happened? His jaw tightened. Black ice. He spoke as though every word had sharp edges. Mountain highway. They found the truck at sunrise. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. And your baby? He swallowed once. A little girl? Neither of them spoke again for nearly a minute. Sarah instinctively rested both hands over her own stomach. For the first time, she realized why he'd looked terrified when she'd been standing on that roof. He hadn't been seeing a stranger. He'd been reliving the worst day of his own life. Over the following week, something unexpected happened. He kept showing up. Not every hour. Not every day. Just enough. Sometimes he repaired broken fence posts. Sometimes he stacked firewood outside without saying a word. Sometimes he left fresh vegetables from his garden on the porch before disappearing into the forest. Never asking for thanks. Never staying long enough to make her uncomfortable. One afternoon, Sarah finally caught him before he drove away. What's your name? He looked almost surprised she'd asked. Ethan. I'm Sarah. I know. She laughed softly. I suppose everyone in this county knows who the pregnant city girl is. His expression softened. Not everyone. Just me? Their conversations remained short, mostly about lumber. Weather, mountain trails, construction. But every day they became a little longer, a little easier, until one afternoon, Sarah noticed something lying inside his toolbox while handing him a hammer. A framed photograph. A younger Ethan. Clean-shaven. Laughing. His arm wrapped around a beautiful woman whose hand rested gently over a pregnant belly. The picture wasn't hidden. It wasn't displayed. It simply traveled everywhere with him. Like someone he couldn't bear to leave behind. I'm sorry, Sarah whispered after accidentally seeing it. He looked at the photograph before placing it back inside the box. Don't be. After another long silence, he quietly admitted. I keep bringing it because I'm afraid that one day... Oh, Baham. I'll forget her smile. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Not because of the tragedy, but because she suddenly understood something she never had before. Real grief doesn't disappear. It simply learns how to breathe beside you. That evening, after Ethan left, Sarah stood alone inside the crumbling cabin. She looked around at the leaking ceiling, the warped floors, the cracked walls, then unfolded the blueprint once more. This time, instead of seeing charity, she saw hope. For herself, for her unborn daughter, and maybe for the lonely mountain carpenter who still carried a photograph everywhere he went because love had never truly left his heart. The next morning, Sarah walked the mile-long trail to Ethan's workshop. She held the blueprint tightly against her chest. When he looked up from his workbench, covered in sawdust, she took a deep breath and said the words that would change both of their lives forever. If your offer still stands, let's build the house. Construction began the following Monday. There was no ceremony, no speeches, just sunrise spilling across the clearing as Ethan planted the first wooden stake into the ground. He handed Sarah a pair of oversized work gloves. You'll get blisters. She pulled them on anyway. I've survived worse. For the first time in weeks, Ethan actually smiled. That, he said quietly, I believe. The work was harder than Sarah had imagined. Every stone had to be cleared by hand. Every foundation trench measured twice before a shovel ever touched the ground. By noon, her shoulders burned. By evening, her hands shook from exhaustion. She collapsed onto an overturned log, laughing breathlessly. I used to complain about sitting through 3-hour meetings. Ethan continued stacking rocks. Different kind of tired? No. She smiled. A better kind. He nodded without looking up. I know. Days slowly settled into a comfortable rhythm. They worked through cool mornings, shared simple lunches beneath towering pine trees, finished each afternoon watching sunlight disappear behind the mountains. Sometimes they barely spoke. Oddly, those silent hours became Sarah's favorite. There was no pressure to impress Ethan. No pretending everything was fine. He never filled quiet moments with meaningless conversation. He understood something few people ever did. Silence wasn't emptiness. Sometimes it was trust. One afternoon, Ethan was teaching Sarah how to frame a wall. She struggled to hold the heavy board steady while balancing the level. It's crooked. It isn't. It is. It isn't. She narrowed her eyes. You always this stubborn. He looked perfectly serious. No. A beat passed. Only when I'm right. Sarah burst into laughter. Real laughter. The kind she hadn't heard from herself in almost a year. The sound echoed across the valley. Ethan froze. Not because of the noise, but because he'd forgotten how beautiful genuine laughter could be. For just a second. He wasn't standing on a construction site. He was back in another lifetime, listening to his wife laughing while they painted nursery walls together. The memory hit so suddenly he turned away. Sarah noticed immediately. Ethan. I'm fine. No, she said softly. You're remembering her? He remained silent. Finally he nodded. I thought if enough years passed, it would stop hurting. Sarah stepped beside him. It doesn't. He looked surprised. My father died when I was 19. She stared toward the distant mountains. I still reach for my phone sometimes, as if I can call him. Their eyes met. Neither offered advice. Neither tried to fix the other. Some wounds didn't need solutions. Only understanding. A week later, the cabin's wooden frame finally stood upright. It wasn't much yet. Just beams stretching toward the sky. Still, Sarah couldn't stop smiling. It actually looks like a house. Ethan studied the structure carefully. It'll outlive both of us. She laughed. That's an oddly romantic thing to say. He looked confused. It wasn't supposed to be romantic. I know. She smiled. That's why it was. For a long moment, neither spoke. The breeze carried the scent of cedar through the clearing. Sarah noticed how naturally she'd begun looking for Ethan every morning. How safe she felt whenever she heard his truck climbing the hill. It frightened her. Not because she was falling in love. Because she had promised herself she never would again. The next afternoon, everything changed. Sarah bent to lift a stack of cedar planks. A sharp pain shot across her abdomen. She gasped. The wood slipped from her hands. Ethan crossed the clearing instantly. "What happened?" "I'm okay." Another cramp hit. Harder this time. She grabbed the workbench for balance. Fear flashed across Ethan's face. "Sit." "It's probably nothing." "Sit." His voice carried an authority she'd never heard before. Not angry. Protective. Within minutes, he had her resting beneath the shade of an old pine. He knelt beside her. "When did it start?" "Just now." "Any bleeding?" She shook her head. He checked his watch automatically. His calm frightened her more than panic would have. "You've done this before," she whispered. His eyes remained fixed on her face. "I've seen enough emergencies. Military." He hesitated, then nodded. "Combat medic." Sarah stared. "You never told me. You never asked." The cramps eased after several long minutes. Still, Ethan wasn't convinced. "We're going to the doctor." "I can drive." "No." "Ethan." "No." There was no room for argument. The drive to the mountain clinic passed mostly in silence. Rain tapped softly against the windshield. Sarah watched Ethan gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. "You look more scared than I am." "I am." She frowned. "Why?" He didn't answer immediately. "Finally, I know how fast everything can disappear." Those words settled heavily between them. For the first time, Sarah realized Ethan wasn't protecting her because she was helpless. He was protecting her because he'd already lived through the nightmare of losing someone he loved. He simply couldn't survive watching it happen again. Hours later, the doctor smiled reassuringly. "The baby's heartbeat is strong." Sarah released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "No signs of labor. Just muscle strain and exhaustion." The doctor looked directly at Ethan. "She needs less lifting." He nodded before Sarah could protest. "I'll handle it. I can still work." The doctor raised an eyebrow. "You can supervise." Sarah sighed dramatically. "I hate supervising." "You'll learn." Driving home that evening, neither of them spoke for several miles. Finally, Sarah looked toward him. "You know, I spent months believing I had to prove I could do everything alone." Ethan kept his eyes on the road, and now, she watched sunlight breaking through storm clouds across the valley. "Now I think strength isn't refusing help." She smiled quietly. "I think real strength is knowing who's safe enough to accept it from." For the first time since Kate's death, Ethan felt something inside him begin to loosen. Not guilt, not grief. Hope. Small. Fragile. Almost frightening. Yet impossible to ignore. Because somewhere between hammering nails, sharing quiet lunches, building walls, and protecting one stubborn woman determined to carry the world by herself, he had stopped building only a cabin. Without realizing it, he had begun building a family. Neither of them dared to say those words aloud. But deep inside, both already knew. Nothing about this mountain had happened by accident. The cabin no longer looked like a construction site. It looked like hope taking shape. Each sunrise revealed another piece of the future that only weeks earlier had existed, as nothing more than lines on Ethan's blueprint. The sturdy timber frame now stood proudly against the mountain skyline. Fresh cedar siding glowed warmly beneath the afternoon sun. Wide windows reflected endless forests stretching toward distant peaks, while the covered porch overlooked a peaceful meadow where wildflowers danced whenever the wind wandered through. Every nail driven into those walls carried a promise. Every beam whispered that broken lives could still become something beautiful. Sarah often caught herself standing in the middle of the unfinished living room, unable to move. Not because there was nothing left to do, because she couldn't believe this place was becoming hers. Or perhaps theirs. That single thought frightened her more than she wanted to admit. One crisp morning, Ethan arrived carrying a small wooden box. "I found something." Sarah looked up from the paint samples spread across the floor. "What is it?" Instead of answering, he placed the box in her hands. Inside lay dozens of tiny brass keys, each one different, each one carefully polished. "They belonged to my grandfather," Ethan explained. "He made furniture for nearly 60 years. Sarah picked one up. "They're beautiful." He believed every home deserved its own story. Ethan smiled faintly. So whenever he finished building a house, he'd hand the owner an old key. Sarah frowned. "But they don't open anything." "Exactly." She looked at him, puzzled. "My grandfather used to say, 'The most important doors you'll ever walk through don't need keys.'" Sarah traced her fingers across the worn brass. For reasons she couldn't explain, her eyes filled with tears. As summer settled over the mountains, her pregnancy became impossible to hide. Her movements slowed. Simple tasks took longer. Ethan never pointed it out. He simply adapted. Without a word, he quietly lifted every heavy board before she reached it. He climbed every ladder himself. He carried every bucket. Whenever Sarah protested, he always answered the same way. "You've already got the hardest job." One afternoon she laughed. "I'm pregnant, Ethan. Not made of glass." "I know." He kept sanding a window frame. "But you're carrying someone who is—" That single sentence stayed with her all day. Nobody had ever spoken about her baby with such quiet respect. Not doctors. Not friends. Certainly not the man who had walked away. A few days later, rain forced them to stop working early. Thunder rolled softly beyond the valley while drops tapped against the unfinished roof. They sat on the porch steps, sharing hot coffee, watching mist drift between the pine trees. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "What made you stay here?" Ethan watched the rain. "I tried leaving." She turned toward him. "You did." He nodded. "3 times. What happened?" "I always came back." "Why?" He smiled without humor. "Grief travels faster than any truck." Sarah lowered her eyes. "I thought moving here would erase mine." "It doesn't." "No." She wrapped both hands around the warm mug. "It just gives it room to breathe." For a long moment, neither looked at the other. The mountain seemed to understand conversations that required no words. The following weekend, Sarah discovered something she hadn't felt in nearly a year. Purpose. While organizing the cabin's interior, she found herself sketching furniture arrangements inside an old notebook. Then she drew the porch, the windows, the meadow. Without realizing it, she filled page after page. Ethan walked in carrying lumber and stopped. "You drew that?" Sarah looked embarrassed. "I used to sketch before everything became computers." He studied the drawings carefully. Not politely, seriously. Like every line mattered. "These aren't hobbies." She smiled. "They're just drawings." "No." He looked directly at her. "They're work." She blinked. "What do you mean?" "You see details most people miss." He pointed toward her sketch of the cabin. "You didn't draw a building. You drew what it feels like." No one had ever described her work that way. Not clients. Not professors. Not even her former fiancé. Something awakened inside her. A part of herself she believed had disappeared forever. That evening, Ethan returned, carrying an old camera. "I've got an idea." She raised an eyebrow. "You own a camera." "My sister gave it to me years ago." He placed it on the table. "We photograph your drawings." Sarah looked confused. "Then what? You sell them?" She laughed. "Who's going to buy pictures of cabins?" "People who own cabins." She smiled. "You're serious." "I am." He began listing names. Vacation homeowners, local bed and breakfast owners, families who had lived in the valley for generations, people who treasured these mountains. "I know them." He shrugged. They'll know your work. For the first time since losing her career, Sarah saw something she hadn't dared imagine. A future she could build herself. Not by returning to the city. Not by depending on someone else. But by rediscovering the woman she had once been. Over the next several weeks, the workshop transformed into an unexpected art studio. Every afternoon, Ethan built furniture while Sarah sketched. The rhythmic sound of his plane smoothing cedar boards blended with the quiet scratch of her pencil across thick paper. Neither interrupted the other. Yet somehow, they worked together perfectly. Sometimes Ethan glanced over. Sometimes Sarah caught herself watching his hands. Strong hands. Scarred hands. Hands capable of lifting massive beams, yet gentle enough to carve delicate flowers into a baby's cradle. She realized something then. Every piece he built carried love. Not because he carved hearts into wood, because he built everything as though someone precious would one day touch it. One evening, as golden sunlight poured through the workshop windows, Ethan quietly walked toward her carrying something hidden beneath a canvas cloth. I finished another project. Sarah smiled. For a customer, he hesitated. No. Slowly, he lifted the cloth away. Sarah's breath caught. It was the most beautiful cradle she had ever seen. Handcrafted from rich walnut, softly curved runners, tiny carved wildflowers climbing each corner, a crescent moon engraved above the headboard. Every detail perfect, every surface polished until it glowed like honey beneath the evening light. She covered her mouth. Ethan. His voice was almost a whisper. I started building it before I even knew whether you'd stay. Tears blurred her vision. He looked down, almost embarrassed. I guess. He smiled faintly. I was hoping. Sarah stepped closer, gently running her fingertips across the smooth wood. Then she looked back at the man standing quietly beside it. For months, Ethan had believed he was building a cabin for a stranger. But somewhere along the way, without either of them noticing, he had begun preparing a home for someone he could no longer imagine living without. And deep inside her heart, Sarah realized she had stopped dreaming about escaping the mountains. She had quietly started dreaming about everything that might still be possible there. Autumn arrived quietly. The mountains traded their deep summer greens for brilliant shades of crimson, amber, and gold. Every trail looked as though it had been painted by hand, and every crisp morning carried the scent of cedar, wood smoke, and approaching winter. The cabin was finally complete. Not almost. Not nearly. Complete. Sunlight poured through the large windows Ethan had carefully positioned to catch the morning light. The stone fireplace warmed the open living room exactly as he'd imagined months earlier on a folded blueprint that had once seemed impossible. Sarah stood alone in the doorway. One hand rested beneath her 8-month pregnant belly. The other traced the smooth wooden frame. She remembered arriving with nothing but fear. Now she had a home, not because someone had rescued her, but because someone had quietly believed she deserved one. That afternoon, Ethan carried the last toolbox toward his truck. I guess. He looked back at the cabin. My job's finished. The words were simple, yet they landed heavily. Sarah suddenly realized something she hadn't prepared herself for. If the construction was over, what reason would he have to come every day? No more blueprints. No more framing walls. No more shared lunches beneath the old pine tree. No more laughing over crooked boards and stubborn nails. The project that had brought them together had reached its end. For the first time in months, the future felt uncertain again. 3 days passed. The silence was unbearable. Sarah wandered through every room, arranging books that didn't need arranging. She folded baby blankets twice. She reorganized kitchen shelves. She even polished windows that were already spotless. None of it helped. The house felt strangely empty. Not because it lacked furniture, because it lacked him. On the 4th morning, a familiar truck climbed the driveway. Sarah hurried outside before she could stop herself. You forgot something. Ethan looked puzzled. No. He held up a small bundle of split firewood. Forecast says temperatures drop tonight. You came all the way up here for firewood. You'll need dry wood. She laughed. I already have a full stack. I know. Then why bring more? He shifted awkwardly. I was cutting some anyway. The excuse was so transparent that Sarah couldn't help smiling. You missed me. His ears turned slightly red. I was in the neighborhood. She looked towards the endless forest surrounding them. You live 6 miles away. A long silence followed. Finally. So did you. Neither of them laughed. Because they both knew the truth. Neither had come outside because of the firewood. As the days passed, Ethan found new reasons to visit. He adjusted a porch hinge that worked perfectly. Checked the chimney twice in 1 week. Sharpened kitchen knives that were already sharp. Built another shelf no one had requested. Sarah recognized every excuse. And secretly, she loved every one of them. Then, just as life began settling into a peaceful rhythm, the past returned. Without warning, a sleek black SUV rolled into the driveway one cold November afternoon. Sarah recognized it immediately. Her heart stopped. Lucas, the man who had abandoned her. He climbed out wearing an expensive wool coat completely unsuited for mountain life. Everything about him still looked polished. Perfect hair. Perfect watch. Perfect smile. As though the last 8 months had never happened. He stared at Sarah's pregnant belly for several long seconds. My God. His voice barely escaped. You really kept the baby. Sarah folded her arms instinctively. I told you I would. He lowered his eyes. I was hoping you'd changed your mind. I didn't. Silence stretched between them. Finally, he whispered. I made the biggest mistake of my life. He asked if he could come inside, against her better judgment. Sarah agreed. Not because she wanted him back. Because she wanted answers. The cabin felt strangely different with Lucas inside. He admired the exposed beams, the handcrafted furniture, the mountain views. This place is incredible. Sarah nodded. It is. Who built it? A friend. Lucas looked around. You've done well. She almost laughed. No, she hadn't done well. She had survived. There was a difference. I've changed, Lucas finally said. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I've spent every day regretting what I said. Sarah remained silent. I panicked. I was scared. I wasn't ready. His voice cracked. I've rented a house. I've prepared a nursery. I've even taken parenting classes. He stepped closer. I want our daughter. Our family. I want to fix this. For just a moment, Sarah remembered the man she had once loved. The dreams they'd shared. The life they had planned. But memories have a dangerous way of forgetting pain. Before she could answer, another truck pulled into the driveway. Ethan. He stepped out carrying groceries and a bag of fresh apples from a nearby orchard. The moment he saw Lucas standing inside the cabin, everything changed. His expression remained calm, but Sarah noticed the subtle tightening of his jaw. He walked inside quietly. I brought groceries. His eyes met Sarah's. You okay? She nodded. Yes. Lucas extended his hand. I'm Lucas. The baby's father. Ethan accepted the handshake politely. Ethan? Nothing more. No challenge. No hostility. Just quiet dignity. Yet the room suddenly felt much smaller. Lucas looked around again. So, he smiled politely. You're the carpenter. Ethan nodded. Lucas gestured toward the walls. You've done amazing work. Thank you. You must spend a lot of time here. I do. Lucas's smile grew thinner. I imagine Sarah appreciates that. Ethan looked toward Sarah before answering. I helped where I could. Simple, honest, nothing more. Yet somehow, everything more. After Ethan left, Lucas finally asked the question he'd been holding back. "Are you two together?" Sarah looked towards the window. She watched Ethan's truck disappear down the mountain road. The answer should have been simple, but it wasn't. Because somewhere between shared grief, countless quiet mornings, 1,000 unspoken acts of kindness, and a house built board by board, something had changed. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Love hadn't arrived like lightning. It had arrived like sunrise, so slowly. She hadn't even noticed the darkness disappearing. For the first time since Lucas walked back into her life, Sarah understood something that changed everything. She wasn't choosing between two men. She was choosing between two versions of herself. The frightened woman who once begged not to be abandoned, or the strong woman who had learned that real love never asks you to sacrifice your child to receive it. Standing in the warm cabin Ethan had built with his own hands, the answer was already waiting inside her heart. She simply hadn't found the courage to speak it aloud. Yet. Winter arrived earlier than anyone expected. Within days, the mountains disappeared beneath layers of snow so deep they erased every familiar trail. Towering pines bowed beneath their frozen burden, while icy winds howled through the valleys with enough force to shake windows and rattle porch rails. By then, Sarah was just days away from her due date. Every morning Ethan still appeared without fail, sometimes carrying fresh firewood, sometimes checking the generator, sometimes bringing warm bread from the small bakery in town. Never because she asked, always because he knew. Neither of them had spoken about what happened after Lucas's visit. There was no need. Some answers didn't require words. They revealed themselves through actions. 3 nights before Christmas, the weather changed without warning. The emergency radio crackled to life. Severe winter storm warning, expected snowfall exceeding 3 feet, all mountain roads closed until further notice. Sarah exchanged a nervous glance with Ethan. "This one feels different," she whispered. He nodded. "It is." They spent the afternoon preparing. Extra blankets, water containers, medical supplies, firewood stacked shoulder-high beside the fireplace. When the first heavy snowflakes began falling, the world outside disappeared behind a curtain of white. Then the electricity failed. The cabin fell into darkness. Only the dancing firelight remained. Around midnight, Sarah woke suddenly. A sharp pain stole her breath. She sat upright. Another contraction? Longer! Stronger. She looked at the clock. 7 minutes later, another one came. "Ethan." Her voice barely carried beyond the bedroom. Yet somehow he heard it instantly. Within seconds he was beside her. His expression changed the moment he saw her face. "It's time." Sarah nodded, struggling to stay calm. "My water." She stopped. Warmth spread beneath her. Then came another contraction that bent her forward. It broke. Outside, the blizzard had become a wall of ice and wind. The nearest hospital was over an hour away. Tonight, it might as well have been on another continent. Ethan reached for the emergency radio. Nothing. No signal. The phone lines were already down. Snow had buried the roads. No ambulance. No helicopter. No rescue. Only the two of them. He took one slow breath. Then another. The calm Sarah had always admired returned instantly. "Listen to me." He knelt in front of her. "We're going to bring our little girl into the world. Together." His steady voice quieted the panic racing through her chest. "You sound awfully confident." He smiled gently. "I'm terrified." She almost laughed through the pain. "So am I." Years earlier, before becoming a master carpenter, Ethan had served as an army combat medic. He had treated wounded soldiers under impossible conditions. He had delivered babies in disaster zones where hospitals no longer existed. skills he had prayed he would never need again. Tonight, they became the reason hope still existed. He transformed the bedroom into a delivery room, clean blankets, sterile supplies, boiling water, everything arranged with calm precision. Outside, the storm screamed against the cabin walls. Inside, a different battle had begun. Hour after hour passed. Sarah fought through every contraction, every wave stronger than the last. Fear whispered that she couldn't continue. Pain insisted she had reached her limit. Every time she closed her eyes, Ethan's voice found her again. "You're doing beautifully. Breathe!" One at a time. "She's almost here." At one point, Sarah grabbed his hand with surprising strength. "I can't." Tears streamed down her face. "I can't do this anymore." Ethan looked directly into her eyes. His own glistened in the firelight. "Yes." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "You can..." "Because you already have..." She frowned through another contraction. "What do you mean? The hardest part wasn't tonight." He squeezed her trembling hand. "The hardest part..." Han Biswaim. Was the day you chose your daughter instead of the life you thought you wanted. You've been fighting for her ever since. You've never stopped. His words broke something inside her. Not her strength, her fear. She wasn't alone anymore. She hadn't been for a very long time. With one final push, the room suddenly filled with the most beautiful sound either of them had ever heard. A baby's cry. Strong, loud, defiant, alive. Sarah collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming freely down her face. Ethan carefully lifted the tiny newborn into his arms. For just one brief moment, time stopped. He stared at the little girl. His hands trembled, not from fear, from memory. Years ago, he had imagined holding his own daughter exactly like this, a dream stolen before it ever began. Now, life had placed another little girl in his arms, not to replace what he had lost, but to remind him that love never truly dies. It simply finds another way to live. He gently placed the baby onto Sarah's chest. "Hello, sweetheart," Sarah whispered. "We've been waiting for you." The tiny infant opened sleepy blue eyes, then wrapped impossibly small fingers around Ethan's thumb. He froze. A single tear escaped before he could hide it. Sarah looked up at him. "She already knows you." He couldn't answer. His heart was too full. As dawn finally broke, the storm began to fade. Golden sunlight spilled across the snow-covered valley, transforming the frozen landscape into a sea of sparkling diamonds. The cabin Ethan had built stood warm and steady against the endless white. Inside, a fire crackled softly. A newborn slept peacefully between two people whose lives had once been shattered beyond recognition. Later that afternoon, the roads finally reopened. Lucas arrived, breathless after hearing about the birth. He stepped quietly inside. His eyes immediately found Sarah. Then the baby. Then Ethan gently rocking the cradle he had carved months before. Everything became clear. No arguments were necessary. No jealousy remained. Some truths speak louder than words. Lucas slowly walked toward Sarah. "I was too late." She looked at him with kindness instead of anger. "No." She smiled softly. "You simply arrived after someone else chose to stay." Lucas nodded, tears filling his eyes. He bent down and kissed his daughter's forehead. "I'll always love her." "I know," Sarah replied. "And if you truly love her, be the father she deserves, not the man you used to be." He whispered, "I will." Then he quietly walked away. Not defeated, but changed. That evening, Ethan stood alone on the porch watching snow drift gently from the pine branches. Sarah stepped outside, their daughter sleeping peacefully inside. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Sarah slipped her hand into his. "You know, she smiled through happy tears. "You never really built me a cabin." Ethan looked at her. "No," she shook her head. "You built a place where broken hearts could become whole again." He looked toward the glowing windows where their daughter slept safely inside, then back at the woman who had unknowingly rebuilt him at the very same time. The mountains had brought them together. Grief had introduced them. Hope had transformed them. And love had quietly built the strongest home either of them would ever know. Life rarely unfolds the way we imagine. Most of us spend years creating careful plans, choosing careers, building relationships, saving for the future, believing that if we make enough good decisions, happiness will naturally follow. But life has a way of interrupting even the best laid plans. Sometimes, everything falls apart with a single phone call. Sometimes with one unexpected diagnosis. Sometimes with 6 heartbreaking words spoken by someone we trusted. Sarah believed losing the man she loved was the greatest tragedy she would ever face. She was wrong. Because losing the wrong person made room for the right people to enter her life. Had she stayed with someone who demanded she sacrifice her child to earn his love, she might have gained comfort, but she would have lost herself. Instead, she chose the harder road, the uncertain road, the lonely road, and although it was filled with fear, tears, and sleepless nights, it also led her to something she never thought she would find again. Peace! This story reminds us that real love never arrives with ultimatums. It never says, "Choose me or your dreams." It never says, "Become someone else so I'll stay." Real love quietly asks, "How can I help carry what you're already carrying?" That was the difference between Lucas and Ethan. One loved only when life was convenient. The other loved without asking for recognition. One built promises with words. The other built trust with actions. In the end, Sarah didn't choose the man who spoke the most beautiful sentences. She chose the man whose everyday choices quietly proved what love truly meant. Perhaps the greatest lesson of all belongs to Ethan. For years, he believed grief had stolen every chance he had at happiness. He thought loving again would somehow betray the family he had lost. But love isn't divided. It grows. The heart doesn't replace one person with another. It simply creates more room. Kate was never forgotten. She became part of the reason Ethan knew exactly how precious every moment with Sarah and little Lily truly was. Sometimes the people we lose don't disappear from our lives. They shape the people we become for those who arrive later. And maybe that's one of life's greatest miracles. If you're watching this today while carrying your own heartbreak, if someone walked away from you, or if you've been told you're not enough, if you're standing in the middle of a season where nothing makes sense, remember this. A closed door is not always a punishment. Sometimes it's protection. Sometimes the road that feels like the end is quietly leading you toward the life you were always meant to live. Don't give up because your story doesn't look like everyone else's. Some of the strongest homes are built after the fiercest storms. Some of the deepest love stories begin after the greatest heartbreak. And some of the happiest endings arrive only after we find the courage to keep taking one more step, even when we can't yet see where the path will lead. One day you'll look back at the moment that almost broke you and realize it became the moment that rebuilt you. Call to Action CTA. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to let us know in the comments. What was the hardest season of your life that eventually became your greatest blessing? Your story may give hope to someone who needs it today. If you enjoyed this journey of hope, healing, and second chances, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our next inspiring story. And if there's someone in your life who needs a reminder that it's never too late to start over, share this video with them today. Until next time, remember, The strongest homes aren't always built with wood and stone. They're built with courage, kindness, and hearts that choose to love again.